There is a category of crime that exists outside the boundaries of what most people are willing to imagine. Not crimes of passion, not crimes of desperation, not crimes that, when examined through the lens of circumstance, carry some trace of the understandable human impulses, fear, grief, rage, that so often push ordinary people toward extraordinary violence. These are different. These are crimes of planning, of patience, of methodology so deliberate, so careful, so sustained across months and years, and sometimes decades that the word crime barely captures what they were. These were systems designed to harm, to deceive, to exploit, and in most of these cases, to kill, built by people who lived among their neighbors, held conversations with their families, smiled in photographs, and attended community events, all while doing things that most human beings cannot bring themselves to fully contemplate. We are going to contemplate them today, not because the darkness is entertaining, because understanding it, naming it, examining it, refusing to look away from it, is the only honest response to what these cases reveal. 6 cases, 6 killers, 6 stories that, once you hear them, you will not forget. 6 cases. Verified. Documented. Real. Chicago, Illinois. 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition. In 1893, the city of Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, one of the most celebrated events in American history. 27 million people attended over 6 months. It was a spectacle of human achievement, towering white buildings, electric lights, the first ever Ferris wheel. It was the occasion for hope, for wonder, for the sense that humanity, in the final decade of the 19th century, was building something magnificent. It was also, for a man named Herman Webster Mudgett, who went by the name Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, the greatest opportunity he had ever been given. Not for wonder, not for achievement, for murder. For Herman Mudgett, the World's Fair was an opportunity, not the kind you're thinking of. Holmes was born in 1861 in New Hampshire. He was, from childhood, a person of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary cruelty, a combination that, in adults, produces people the world is entirely unprepared for. He obtained a medical degree from the University of Michigan in 1884, where, investigators would later discover, he had been stealing corpses from the laboratory and using them to fraudulently claim life insurance payouts, disfiguring the bodies, creating false identities, collecting money from policies he had taken out in the stolen names. He was 23 years old. He had not yet built his hotel. In 1886, Holmes arrived in Chicago. He worked in a pharmacy, charmed the owner, a widow, into giving him increasing responsibility, and eventually took over the business entirely after the widow mysteriously disappeared. He was building something, though the neighborhood did not yet know it. On the corner of 63rd Street and South Wallace Avenue in the Englewood neighborhood, Holmes began construction of a 3-story building in 1887. From the outside, it looked like a mixed-use commercial block. A hotel, shops, apartments. Perfectly ordinary. On the inside, it was something else entirely. From the outside, an ordinary hotel. On the inside, something else entirely. Holmes was his own architect and his own general contractor. A deliberate choice. He cycled through construction crews constantly, firing each team before they could finish their section of the building and observe what the completed whole looked like. No single worker ever saw the entire building. What they built, in aggregate, was a structure of approximately 60 rooms across 3 floors. Rooms that, when investigators finally mapped them after Holmes's arrest, revealed a floor plan that had no rational explanation except one. The building had been designed to trap, to kill, and to dispose. Rooms with no windows and doors that locked only from the outside. Pipes that pumped gas into sleeping quarters. A chute that ran from the upper floors to the basement. A kiln in the basement large enough to cremate a human body. An acid vat. A dissection table. A rack. A dissection table. A kiln. Iraq, built into the original construction. During the World's Fair, when Chicago was flooded with visitors from across the country, many of them young women traveling alone, seeking work, seeking opportunity, Holmes opened his hotel to guests. He was charming. He was educated. He was handsome in the way that 1890s photographs suggest. Well-dressed, composed, projecting the trustworthy gravitas of a physician. Young women came. Young women stayed. And young women disappeared. Holmes was not arrested until 1894, and not for murder. He was arrested for insurance fraud. An investigation into a complex horse fraud scheme led investigators to begin pulling at the threads of Holmes's financial history, and what unraveled was something that even experienced detectives were not prepared for. In July 1895, Chicago police entered the building that had become known publicly as Holmes's castle. What they found inside took weeks to fully document. They found the gas pipes running into sealed rooms. They found the chute to the basement. They found the kiln with fragments of bone that had not been fully cremated. They found evidence in the acid vats, in the basement floor, in the general architecture of a building that had been designed from its foundations as an instrument of death, of an operation that had been running for years. Holmes confessed to 27 murders, though historians and criminologists believe the true number is significantly higher, potentially exceeding 200. He was tried for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, a business associate. He was convicted. He was hanged on May 7, 1896. He was 34 years old. Convicted. Hanged. May 7, 1896. 34 years old. Before his execution, Holmes made a final statement. He said he was born with the devil in him, that he could not help what he was. He was wrong about one thing. It was not inspiration. It was construction. It was planning. It was a hotel he had built with the specific intention of killing people inside it. The devil, if there was one, was in the blueprints. Case 1 of 6. H. Holmes. The Murder Castle. There are killers who are defined by scale, by the architecture of their crimes, by the systems they built. And then there are killers who are defined by the peculiar, almost incomprehensible ordinariness of everything around them. Nanny Doss was the second kind. Nancy Hazel was born on November 4, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama. She grew up in rural poverty, in a household her own accounts described as strict and joyless. She developed, from a very early age, a deep and consuming love of romance magazines, the pulp fiction of the era, and a conviction that somewhere out there was a perfect love, a perfect partnership, a life that matched the stories she read by lamplight in her family's farmhouse. She would spend the next 5 decades looking for it. She would also, along the way, kill 11 people. She killed 11 people while searching for perfect love. Nanny married for the first time in 1921, at the age of 16, to Charles Braggs. They had 4 children together. 2 of those children died in what was recorded as food poisoning. The marriage ended in 1927. She remarried in 1929 to Frank Harrelson. He was a drinker. He was, by her accounts, far from the ideal of the romance magazines. In 1945, Frank Harrelson died after eating a bowl of stewed prunes. He was the first husband. He would not be the last. She met her third husband, Arlie Lanning, in 1947 through a Lonely Hearts column in a newspaper, the 1940s equivalent of an online dating profile. He was dead by 1952. Her mother-in-law, who had been living with them, died shortly afterward. His house burned down. Nanny collected the insurance. His house burned down. She collected the insurance. She moved on. Her fourth husband, Richard Morton, died in 1953 after a short illness. Her own mother, who had come to visit, died during the same period. Her fifth and final husband was Samuel Doss, an Oklahoma man she met through another Lonely Hearts column in 1953. He was a religious, careful man. He disapproved of Nanny's romance magazines. He was controlling about money. He was, in the language of her romanticized worldview, deeply disappointing. Samuel Doss died on October 5, 1954. His doctor, conducting a routine review of the death, noticed something that concerned him enough to request an autopsy. The autopsy found a lethal quantity of arsenic in Samuel Doss's body. Lethal arsenic. The fifth husband, the last one, Nanny Doss, was arrested in November 1954. The investigation that followed was the kind that, once it begins moving backward through a person's history, produces a picture so consistent, so methodical, so repetitive that it becomes impossible to explain as coincidence. For husbands poisoned, 2 children whose food poisoning deaths, re-examined in light of everything else, looked significantly less like illness. A grandson, a sister, 2 additional deaths in the family orbit. When investigators questioned Nanny Doss about the deaths, they encountered something that became one of the most remarked upon aspects of this case. She laughed, not the laugh of a woman who found something genuinely funny, not the inappropriate nervous laughter of someone overwhelmed by a situation. A light, casual, almost girlish laugh, the laugh of a woman who had decided, apparently long ago, that the circumstances she was being asked about were simply not that serious. She was, newspapers of the era noted with bewildered fascination, giggly. Hence the nickname she would carry forever, the Giggling Granny. She laughed when they asked about the deaths. They called her the Giggling Granny. Nanny Doss pleaded guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss in 1955. She was sentenced to life in prison. She died in prison in 1965 of leukemia. She was 59 years old. She never, in any formal statement, fully explained why. The closest she came was this. She told investigators that none of her husbands had ever been quite what she was looking for. She had been waiting for the right man. She had simply, along the way, disposed of the wrong ones. Case 2 of 6. Nanny Doss, the Giggling Granny. Belle Gunness understood something about human nature that most predators miss. She understood that the most effective trap is one the prey walks into willingly. She understood that loneliness, real, aching, persistent loneliness, will make a person override almost every instinct they have. And she built her operation around that understanding with the methodical patience of a farmer tending a crop. Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth was born in 1859 in Bygda, Norway. She emigrated to the United States in 1881, eventually settling in Illinois, where she became Belle Gunness. Her first husband, Mads Sorensen, died in 1900. On the one day of the year, investigators would later note with significance, on which his 2 life insurance policies overlapped. Belle collected both policies. 2 of their children also died young, in circumstances that were recorded as illness. Both were insured. Belle collected. She moved to a farm in Lawport, Indiana. Her second husband, Peter Gunness, died in 1902, killed, according to Belle, when a meat grinder fell from a shelf and struck him on the head. She collected his life insurance. Peter's daughter, who had witnessed what happened to her father, was initially suspicious. She was later found dead. The witness to her husband's death was later found dead. And now Belle Gunness did something that makes this case unlike almost any other case of this era. She advertised. She placed personal notices in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest and in general circulation papers in multiple states. The advertisements were framed as Lonely Hearts notices, a widow of means, seeking a hard-working Scandinavian man, preferably one with some financial resources of his own, for companionship and possible marriage. The notices worked. Men came from Illinois, from Minnesota, from Wisconsin, from South Dakota, from as far away as Norway itself. Men who had seen the notice and made the journey to Lawport to meet the widow who had her own farm and was looking for a partner. They brought their savings. They brought their life insurance documentation, which Belle asked to review for practical purposes. And they disappeared. They brought their savings. They disappeared. The discovery came in April 1908, when Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground. In the ruins, investigators found 4 bodies, 3 children, and a headless female body initially assumed to be Belle Gunness herself. But the body was smaller than Belle, significantly smaller, and as investigators began to excavate the farmland, what they found complicated the question of whether Belle Gunness had died in that fire considerably. They found bodies in the yard, in the pig pen, in various locations across the farm property. In total, investigators estimated between 16 and 28 bodies were recovered from or associated with Belle Gunness' Lawport farm. Between 16 and 28 bodies. On one farm, over 8 years, a farmhand named Ray Lamphere, who had worked for Belle and had been dismissed shortly before the fire, was arrested and charged with arson and murder. He was convicted of arson. He died in prison in 1909 of tuberculosis. Before he died, he told a cellmate that Belle had killed the woman whose body was found in the farmhouse and had escaped, that the fire had been part of a planned disappearance, and that Belle Gunness was alive somewhere, probably under a new name. He said she escaped, that she was alive, under a new name. Belle Gunness was never conclusively identified as dead. No confirmed sighting of her was ever verified after 1908. She was, by all the evidence of her operational history, extraordinarily capable of becoming someone else, somewhere else, with a clean slate. The question of whether she died in that fire, or whether she walked away from it, the way she had walked away from everything else, has never been definitively answered. She may have been one of the most prolific female serial killers in American history. She may also have gotten away. Case 3 of 6. Belle Gunness, the Black Widow of Indiana. Every technology that has ever existed, humans have found ways to use for harm. The printing press produced propaganda. The telephone enabled fraud. The postal service carried threats. And the early internet, the bulletin boards, the chat rooms, the primitive forums of the mid-1990s, found its first known serial killer in a suburban Kansas businessman named John Edward Robinson. Robinson was born in 1943 in Cicero, Illinois. He was, from early adulthood, a con artist, and a remarkably effective one. He forged documents, fabricated credentials, stole from employers and clients, defrauded the elderly, and consistently presented to the world the image of a successful, personable, community-oriented businessman while operating, beneath that surface, as a systematic predator. By the 1980s, he had already been convicted of theft and fraud multiple times. He had served time. He had been on probation. The legal system knew who he was, in the specific, documented sense of having his name in court records across multiple jurisdictions. None of that stopped him. Multiple fraud convictions, probation, court records across multiple states. It didn't stop him. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1984 when a 19-year-old woman named Paula Godfrey, whom he had recruited with promises of employment, disappeared. She was never found. He continued. In 1985, a young woman named Lisa Stasi disappeared after Robinson promised her housing and employment assistance through a charitable organization he had fabricated. Her infant daughter was placed with Robinson's brother and his wife, who had been told the child was available for adoption, through Robinson, who had created fraudulent adoption paperwork. Lisa Stasi was never found. Her daughter grew up with Robinson's brother. She did not learn the full truth of what had happened until much later. He fabricated an adoption. The child's mother was never found. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Robinson continued to operate, always under the cover of charitable and business ventures, always targeting women who were in some form of vulnerability, young women seeking work, women escaping difficult situations, women who needed help and found, in Robinson's well-practiced presentation, someone who appeared to offer it. And then the internet arrived. Robinson was an early adopter. In the mid-1990s, he discovered the alternative lifestyle chat rooms that were emerging on the early internet. He created personas. He developed online relationships. He was, by multiple accounts of people who interacted with him online. A skilled conversationalist, attentive, persuasive, and patient in a way that translated effectively to the text-based intimacy of early chat rooms. He met women online. He persuaded them to meet in person. He offered them the kind of arrangements, financial support, housing, structured relationships that, to women in vulnerable circumstances, could sound like exactly what they needed. He lured at least 3 confirmed victims through online contact in the 1990s alone. He used early internet chat rooms to find his last victims. A decade before social media, he was finally arrested in June 2000 when a victim who had survived an encounter with him filed a complaint. The complaint triggered a search of his properties. On his rural farm property in Lynn County, Kansas, investigators found 2 barrels. Inside those barrels were the bodies of 2 women who had been reported missing. Additional barrels were found at a storage locker. 3 more bodies. In total, the physical evidence connected Robinson to the murders of 8 women spanning 16 years. 8 confirmed victims. 16 years. Rural Kansas. He was convicted in Kansas in 2002 and sentenced to death. A separate conviction in Missouri resulted in a life sentence. He remains on death row in Kansas as of this production. One of the oldest inmates on Kansas's death row, having exhausted multiple rounds of appeals. The families of his victims have been waiting for more than 2 decades for an execution date. 8 women, 16 years, and a man who found a new hunting ground in a technology that no one had yet learned to fear. Case 4 of 6. John Edward Robinson, the first internet serial killer. There is a point in every genuinely disturbing case where a single image crystallizes everything, where one detail, specific, concrete, undeniable, becomes the thing that makes the abstract horror of what a person did suddenly, viscerally real. In the case of Joe Ball, that image is the alligator pond. Joe Ball was born in 1896 in Elmendorf, Texas, a small community in Behar County south of San Antonio. He served in World War I, returned to Texas, and by the time Prohibition ended in the 1930s had opened a roadside tavern called The Sociable Inn on U.S. Highway 181. The tavern was popular. Joe Ball was a character, loud, entertaining, the kind of man who commanded a room and made sure his customers had a good time. He also kept 5 live alligators in a concrete pond behind the bar. He fed them. He let customers watch. He occasionally staged performances with the alligators for the entertainment of the bar's patrons. It was, by local accounts, a genuine attraction. People drove out of their way to drink at the bar with the alligators. People drove out of their way to see the alligators. They had no idea what they were really looking at. Joe Ball employed a series of young women as waitresses and barmaids. They came. They worked. They disappeared. Not all at once. One at a time, separated by gaps long enough that each disappearance could be individually explained. She ran off with a man. She went to find work somewhere else. She had family troubles. She didn't say goodbye. Ball explained them away casually, and the community, not yet aware of the pattern, accepted the explanations. But by 1938, the disappearances had accumulated to a point where law enforcement could no longer ignore them. A Behar County deputy sheriff and a Texas Ranger drove out to the Sociable Inn to ask Joe Ball some questions. Ball let them in. He was, as always, composed at first. He began to answer their questions. And then, as the questioning became more specific, something in Joe Ball's demeanor shifted. He reached under the bar. He pulled out a .45 caliber pistol, and he shot himself in the heart. He pulled a pistol from under the bar and shot himself in front of the officers. The investigation that followed Joe Ball's death filled in the picture he had refused to answer for. His handyman, a man named Clifton Wheeler, eventually broke down and provided investigators with a confession that described, in specific detail, what had been happening to the women who worked at the Sociable Inn. Ball had killed at least 2 of his employees with certainty. Wheeler described helping to dismember bodies and feed them to the alligators. He cooperated with investigators and received leniency. He fed the bodies to the alligators. The handyman confessed. The alligators were removed from the property and relocated. Investigators attempted, over the subsequent investigation, to determine the full scope of what had happened. The forensic challenge that Ball had either deliberately anticipated or had stumbled into through circumstance, was that alligators are extraordinarily effective at eliminating evidence. They consume bone. They consume tissue. They consume, in sufficient time, almost everything. The precise number of Joe Ball's victims has never been established. Estimates range from a minimum of 2 confirmed to as many as 20 based on the full accounting of women who had worked at the sociable inn and were never accounted for. Joe Ball shot himself before any of those questions could be asked of him directly. The alligators, for the most part, had already answered them. Case 5 of 6. Joe Ball, the Alligator Man. Not every case in this documentary is a case of killing. This one is different. This one is a case of a love so distorted, so completely severed from the boundaries of reality and consent and human dignity, that it produced an act that has no comfortable category. It is not murder. It is something else, something that, when examined fully, sits in a space that the law struggled to name in 1940 and that we still, today, find difficult to fully articulate. Karl Julius Tanzler was born in Dresden, Germany, in 1877. He was educated, cultured, and had a history of grand romantic obsessions that had, throughout his life, attached themselves to women who did not reciprocate, whom he imagined loved him, toward whom he constructed elaborate internal narratives that bore little relationship to reality. He worked, in his later years, as an X-ray technician at the United States Marine Hospital in Key West, Florida. Karl Tanzler, X-ray technician, Key West, Florida, 1930. In 1930, a young Cuban-American woman named Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos came to the hospital for treatment. She was 21 years old. She was, by every account, extraordinarily beautiful. She had tuberculosis, which in 1930 was a disease without reliable treatment, a slow, progressive death sentence. Tanzler became her primary medical attendant. He became obsessed with her. He brought her gifts. He told her he loved her. He told her he had dreamed of her, that he had seen her face in a vision years before they met. He told her she was the love he had been searching for his entire life. Elena, by all accounts, was kind to him in the gentle, practiced way that ill people are sometimes kind to the people attending them, neither encouraging him nor wishing to cause unnecessary discomfort. He interpreted kindness as reciprocation. He interpreted tolerance as love. He interpreted her kindness as love. She was trying not to hurt him. Elena de Hoyos died on October 25, 1931. She was 22 years old. Tanzler paid for her funeral. He built her a mausoleum in the Key West Cemetery, an elaborate, expensive tomb to which he had a key. He visited daily. He brought flowers. He sat beside the tomb for hours. And then, approximately 2 years after her death, he returned to the mausoleum at night. And he removed her body. What Karl Tanzler did in the years that followed, between approximately 1933 and 1940, constitutes one of the most documented and disturbing cases of necromantic obsession in recorded history. He transported Elena's body to his home. He worked, using his medical knowledge, to preserve and restore what remained. He used wire and plaster and glass eyes and a wig made of her own hair, which her family had given him at her death. He used perfume, large quantities of it, and preservatives. He dressed her in a wedding gown. He kept her in his home for 7 years. He told neighbors that he had a sick relative staying with him. He referred to Elena, in conversation, as if she were alive. He kept her in his home for 7 years. He referred to her as alive. In October 1940, Elena's sister Nana heard rumors, the kind of rumors that accumulate in a small community over 7 years, Rumors about Tanzler's devotion, about his house, about what was inside it. She went to Tanzler's home and asked to see Elena. He showed her. Nana contacted police immediately. Carl Tanzler was arrested. The public reaction to the case was, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, deeply divided. In Key West, a significant portion of the community responded to Tanzler's story not with horror, but with a kind of sympathetic fascination. He was portrayed by some as a tragic romantic figure, a man destroyed by love. Newspapers across the country ran the story with headlines that were, in many cases, more romantic than condemnatory. Some newspapers treated him as a tragic romantic figure. The charges against Tanzler were ultimately dismissed on a legal technicality. The statute of limitations on disturbing a grave had expired. He was released. He lived until 1952. Elena de Hoyos was reburied, this time in an unmarked grave, so that her location would remain private. She had died at 22. She had spent more years in Carl Tanzler's possession than she had spent as an adult. She had never loved him. She had simply been kind to a sick man who attended her in her dying months. And that kindness, that ordinary, human, compassionate kindness, was all the permission he believed he needed. She never loved him. She was simply kind to him once. The Elena de Hoyos case is disturbing for many of the same reasons the other 5 cases in this documentary are disturbing. Not because of its violence. It contains no violence in the conventional sense. But because of what it reveals about the capacity of a human being to construct a reality entirely divorced from the humanity of another person. To look at a person, at a woman, in this case, at a specific individual with a name and a family and an interior life that was entirely her own, and see not a person, but a possession, not a human being, but a projection. Every case in this documentary, in its own way, is a case about that. The murder castle, where guests were objects to be processed. The giggling granny, where husbands were obstacles to be disposed of. The Black Widow, where men were resources to be extracted. The Internet Killer, where women in chat rooms were prey to be cultivated. The Alligator Man, where employees were problems to be solved. And here, in Key West, where a young woman's dying kindness was transformed, in one man's mind, into a license to own her. Case 6 of 6. Carl Tanzler, the man who refused to let her go. 6 cases. 6 killers. 6 different architectures of harm. A Victorian hotel in Chicago designed from the ground up to kill. A grandmother in Alabama who poisoned 4 husbands while reading romance novels and laughing. A Norwegian farmer in Indiana who advertised for love and buried the men who answered. A Kansas businessman who moved his predation into a new technology and found a new generation of victims there. A Texas barman who kept alligators as both entertainment and evidence disposal. A German radiologist in Key West who decided that his obsession justified everything that followed it. They are not connected by geography. They are not connected by era. They span more than a century of American criminal history, from the 1890s to the end of the 20th century. What connects them is simpler and more unsettling than any geographical or temporal link. What connects them is this. Every one of them operated in plain sight. H.H. Holmes built his castle in a city of 27 million visitors, and no one looked at the blueprints. Nanny Doss buried 4 husbands, and no one counted them. Belle Gunness placed advertisements in newspapers, and men responded. John Edward Robinson walked into chat rooms, and women trusted him. Joe Ball kept alligators behind a public bar, and customers came for the show. Carl Tanzler kept a body in his house for 7 years in a neighborhood where people noticed things. They were visible. They were social. They were, in most cases, well regarded. And that is the lesson, the deeply uncomfortable, impossible to fully absorb lesson, that cases like these insist on delivering. Evil is not always hidden. It is not always in the shadows. Sometimes it is in a hotel on 63rd Street. Sometimes it is at the end of the dinner table. Sometimes it is behind a bar, feeding alligators while the customers drink. We tell these stories because they deserve to be told. Because the victims, the hundreds of unnamed guests at Holmes's hotel, the 4 husbands in Nanny Doss's kitchen, the men who answered Belle Gunness advertisements, the 8 women in Robinson's barrels, the women in Joe Ball's alligator pond, and Elena de Hoyos in her stolen grave, deserve to be remembered. Not as footnotes to the stories of the people who harmed them, but as the reason the stories are worth telling at all. They deserve to be remembered. That is why we tell these stories. Subscribe for new Sinister Secrets investigations every day. Share this video. The stories deserve to be heard. Support us on Sinister Secrets. Link in description. Tell us in the comments, which case disturbed you most?